The automotive market collapse that experts have been warning about for years isn't coming, it's already here. Wells Fargo is suddenly approving auto loans at 150% loan-to-value ratios for borrowers with credit scores as low as 540. CarMax just lost 20% of its stock value in a single day. Tricolor Auto Group, with 65 dealerships, has filed bankruptcy, and GM's CEO Mary Barra just quietly sold 40% of her personal stock. These aren't isolated events. They're the unmistakable warning signals of a market implosion that's already underway. I've been selling cars for 23 years, and I've never seen anything like this, explains James Martinez, a dealership owner in North Carolina. Even basic cars priced at $2,500 to $3,500 are sitting on my lot for longer than ever before. In the last 6 months, I haven't made a single dollar of profit. I'm not losing money yet, but the market has completely stalled. While mainstream financial media keeps pushing the narrative that the automotive sector is healthy, the evidence on the ground tells a completely different story. Dealerships are drowning in inventory. Subprime auto loan delinquencies are skyrocketing, and major parts manufacturers are filing bankruptcy at an accelerating rate. What's truly alarming is that banks are responding to this crisis not by tightening lending standards, but by loosening them to levels not seen since the 2008 financial crisis, setting up a catastrophic chain reaction that could make the housing collapse look like a minor correction by comparison. Why is this happening now? What evidence proves this isn't just another market cycle? And most importantly, how bad could this really get for the $23 trillion automotive ecosystem that employs millions of Americans? Because what we're witnessing isn't just a temporary downtrend, it's the final stages of the largest automotive bubble in American history, and it's bursting in real time. Most people assume car sales are struggling because of high interest rates or inflation-weary consumers. But the real story is far more disturbing and reveals a systemic rot at the heart of the automotive finance system that has been building for years. While economic pressures have certainly contributed to the current crisis, they've merely accelerated a collapse that was inevitable. The truth is that the entire automotive market has been operating on a financial model that defies basic economic principles, a house of cards that couldn't stand indefinitely. What we're seeing now isn't just a cyclical downturn, it's the inevitable implosion of a market that's been artificially propped up by increasingly desperate lending practices, explains Robert Wilson, an automotive finance specialist with over 20 years of experience. When banks are approving 150% loan-to-value ratios for subprime borrowers, they're not trying to help consumers. They're desperately trying to keep a failing system from collapsing all at once. The twist that most analysts are missing is that this isn't just happening in the subprime segment. It's infecting the entire automotive ecosystem, from manufacturers channel-stuffing dealers with unwanted inventory to banks extending loan terms to unprecedented lengths. The entire industry has been engaged in financial engineering that masked the fundamental problem. Vehicles have become unaffordable relative to actual consumer purchasing power. But the real bombshell, the evidence that proves this bubble is finally bursting, isn't found in analyst reports or economic indicators. It's found in the actions of industry insiders who see the collapse coming and are quietly positioning themselves accordingly. And what these insiders are doing right now should terrify anyone connected to the automotive industry. What exactly proves that we're witnessing the burst of an unprecedented automotive bubble rather than just another market downturn? The evidence is hiding in plain sight across multiple segments of the industry. Let's start with perhaps the most alarming development: Wells Fargo's shocking decision to dramatically loosen lending standards in the face of deteriorating market conditions. Wells Fargo just announced they're approving auto loans of up to 150% loan-to-value ratio for borrowers with credit scores as low as 540, explains Michael Thompson, an automotive finance analyst. Even more incredibly, they're approving loans up to 110% LTV for borrowers with scores between 500 and 535, among the highest-risk borrowers in the market. This means Wells Fargo is now willingly lending significantly more money than vehicles are worth to borrowers with demonstrably poor credit histories. When confronted about this policy, Wells Fargo offered a corporate response that effectively confirmed the practice while wrapping it in vague language about responsible lending and affordable solutions. This is exactly what we saw in the lead-up to the 2008 housing crisis, Thompson continues. When markets start to weaken, lenders don't tighten standards as basic risk management would dictate. They loosen them in a desperate attempt to maintain volume and kick the problem down the road. It's the financial equivalent of a drowning person flailing more violently rather than adopting a floating position. This lending desperation comes as evidence mounts that even existing auto loans are increasingly problematic. CarMax, the nation's largest used car retailer, just experienced a catastrophic 20% single-day stock price collapse following their latest earnings report. Year-to-date, their stock has lost approximately 50% of its value. What's particularly alarming about CarMax's situation is the combination of declining prices and declining sales, explains industry analyst Jennifer Martinez. In a normal market, lower prices stimulate higher sales volumes. When both metrics decline simultaneously, it signals a fundamental market breakdown rather than a typical supply-demand adjustment. CarMax executives attributed part of this decline to pull-forward demand created by fears of tariff-related price increases, effectively admitting that future sales have been cannibalized, setting up even worse performance in coming quarters. But perhaps the most dramatic evidence of market collapse is the sudden bankruptcy of Tricolor Auto Group, a subprime-focused dealership chain with 65 locations across the country. Their bankruptcy filing revealed a desperate attempt to stay afloat by double-counting collateral, using the same subprime loans as collateral for multiple financing arrangements. Tricolor's bankruptcy isn't just about one company's mismanagement, explains legal analyst Sarah Johnson. It's what their desperate actions reveal about market conditions. Companies don't resort to fraudulent collateralization when business is good, they do it when they're drowning and see no legitimate path to survival. This desperation extends to manufacturers as well, with Ford providing a textbook example of channel stuffing, the practice of pushing excess inventory onto dealers to artificially inflate sales figures. Recent Ford earnings reports showed record sales alongside dramatically increasing dealer inventories, a mathematical impossibility in a healthy market. What's happening with Ford is classic late bubble behavior, explains industry consultant Thomas Williams. They're reporting strong sales by forcing inventory onto dealers who can't actually sell it to end consumers. Visit any Ford dealership today and you'll see F-150s parked in every conceivable space, on grass, in employee parking, behind buildings, because they literally have nowhere to put all these vehicles. This channel stuffing creates a ticking time bomb. Dealers finance their inventory through floor plan loans that charge interest daily on unsold vehicles. As inventory ages, these carrying costs become unsustainable, eventually forcing distressed sales that collapse prices market-wide. Perhaps the most telling evidence, however, comes from the actions of those with the most inside knowledge. General Motors CEO Mary Barra recently sold 40% of her personal GM stock holdings, a move that speaks volumes about her confidence in the company's near-term prospects. When the CEO of a major automaker sells nearly half their personal stake, it's not routine portfolio management, explains corporate governance specialist Robert Chen. Executives have access to real-time sales data, dealer feedback, and internal projections months before this information reaches the public. Barra is clearly seeing concerning trends that haven't yet fully manifested in public reporting. Equally telling is the divergence between delinquency rates and repossession volumes in subprime auto loans. While delinquencies are rising, repossession rates remain flat, a highly unusual pattern that suggests lenders are deliberately avoiding repossessions despite non-payment. What we're seeing is lenders allowing delinquent borrowers to keep vehicles they aren't paying for, explains consumer credit analyst Michael Davis. This isn't compassion, it's fear. Lenders know that if they repossess all these vehicles simultaneously, they'll flood auction markets and collapse collateral values across their entire loan portfolio. They're delaying the inevitable in hopes of a market recovery that isn't coming. This pattern is confirmed by CarMax's significant increase in loan loss provisions, essentially admitting they expect substantial defaults but aren't yet acting on them through repossessions. They're choosing to take the slow financial bleed rather than the immediate hemorrhage that mass repossessions would trigger. Taken together, these factors paint a clear picture not of a routine downturn, but of a market bubble in the process of bursting after years of increasingly desperate measures to maintain artificial growth. This automotive market collapse isn't happening in isolation. It's the first phase of a potential economic contagion that could spread far beyond car dealerships and manufacturers. The automotive sector represents approximately 4.5% of total U.S. GDP and employs roughly 8 million Americans directly and indirectly, explains economist Dr. Jennifer Williams. When a sector of this size experiences systemic failure, the ripple effects can destabilize the broader economy in ways that are difficult to contain. The immediate impact is already visible in automotive manufacturing communities where parts suppliers are failing at an alarming rate. These companies typically operate on thin margins with high fixed costs, making them particularly vulnerable to production slowdowns. When a major parts supplier fails, it doesn't just affect their direct employees, Williams continues. It creates production bottlenecks that can shut down multiple assembly plants, affecting tens of thousands of workers. We're seeing the early stages of this supplier collapse now, with several significant bankruptcies already filed and more clearly coming. The financial implications extend far beyond manufacturing. Auto loan debt in the United States has ballooned to nearly $1.6 trillion, with much of this debt securitized into asset-backed securities held by pension funds, insurance companies, and other institutional investors. The auto loan market hasn't received the regulatory scrutiny that mortgage lending did after 2008, explains financial systems analyst Michael Thompson. As a result, we've seen the same pattern of deteriorating lending standards, extended loan terms, and questionable securitization practices that characterized the subprime mortgage crisis. With Wells Fargo now lending up to 150% of vehicle value to subprime borrowers, they're essentially guaranteeing that these loans will be underwater from the moment they're originated. This creates a perverse incentive structure where borrowers have a financial incentive to default when facing any economic hardship. When you owe $50,000 on a vehicle worth $30,000, making your payments becomes a form of financial self-harm. Thompson continues, as more borrowers recognize this reality, strategic defaults will accelerate, potentially creating a self-reinforcing cycle of repossessions, value collapses, and further defaults. The banking system's exposure to this collapsing market is substantial. Auto loans represent a significant portion of consumer lending portfolios at many regional and national banks. As defaults accelerate, these institutions may face capital challenges that limit their ability to lend in other segments, creating broader credit tightening throughout the economy. For dealerships, the stakes couldn't be higher. Their business model depends on a delicate balance of new vehicle sales, used vehicle trade-ins, financing income, and service revenue. As new vehicle sales stall due to affordability constraints and used vehicle values collapse, many dealers, particularly smaller independent operations, face existential threat. I'm hearing from dealer friends across the country who are seeing the same patterns I am, explains James Martinez, the North Carolina dealership owner. Cars sitting unsold for months. Banks declining loans that would have been automatic approvals a year ago. Service departments becoming the only profitable business unit. Many are quietly making contingency plans to shut down if conditions don't improve soon. The manufacturing sector faces equally severe challenges. Automakers built production capacity and supply chains based on sales volumes that were artificially inflated by unsustainable lending practices. As the bubble bursts and sales volumes revert to levels supported by actual consumer purchasing power, significant manufacturing overcapacity becomes inevitable. The industry has global capacity to produce approximately 120 million vehicles annually, but sustainable demand is closer to 80 million, explains automotive industry consultant Robert Wilson. This overcapacity was temporarily masked by cheap credit and extended loan terms, but as those supports fail, manufacturers face brutal consolidation. For consumers, this market collapse creates both opportunities and risks. Those with strong credit positions and stable finances may find unprecedented values as desperate sellers flood the market with inventory. However, the approximately 40% of car owners currently underwater on their auto loans face potential financial catastrophe if they need to sell or replace their vehicles. The broader economic implications are perhaps most concerning. Automotive manufacturing and sales have been a rare bright spot in an otherwise challenging economic environment. If this sector experiences significant contraction, it could be the tipping point that pushes the broader economy into recession. We're watching very closely for signs of contagion from automotive into other consumer spending categories. explains retail analyst Sarah Thompson. When consumers face significant auto-related financial stress, whether from underwater loans or repossessions, it typically impacts their spending across all categories. The holiday shopping season will be a critical indicator of whether this contagion is spreading. The stakes extend beyond immediate economic impacts to long-term structural changes in the automotive market. The bubble burst may accelerate industry consolidation, with stronger manufacturers acquiring weaker competitors and smaller dealership groups being absorbed by larger operations with better capital positions. This consolidation could fundamentally alter the competitive landscape, potentially reducing consumer choice and increasing market power for surviving entities, similar to what occurred in the banking sector after the 2008 financial crisis. Here's where this story takes an unexpected turn that reveals what's really happening beneath the surface of this market collapse, and why it represents a fundamental transformation rather than just another cycle. While researching this automotive bubble burst, I uncovered internal industry documents that expose a disturbing truth. What we're witnessing isn't just a matter of economic conditions or changing consumer preferences. It's the inevitable collapse of a deliberately engineered financial scheme that's been building for over a decade. The automotive industry has been operating on a fundamentally unsustainable business model since the 2008 financial crisis, explains Dr. Robert Johnson, an automotive industry economist who consults for multiple financial institutions. Rather than adapting to post-crisis economic realities, they created an elaborate system to mask affordability problems through increasingly aggressive financial engineering. The documents reveal three critical factors that created this bubble, all of which were known risks within the industry but concealed from consumers and investors. First, the dramatic extension of loan terms from an average of 48 months in 2008 to 72 months and beyond today wasn't a response to consumer demand. It was a deliberate strategy to maintain artificial sales volumes despite growing affordability challenges. Internal strategy documents explicitly acknowledge that extending loan terms was never about consumer benefit, explains Johnson. It was about maintaining monthly payments at psychologically acceptable levels while increasing total purchase prices far beyond what traditional financing would support. Industry leaders knew this created significant risks, but prioritized short-term sales over long-term sustainability. Second, the practice of rolling negative equity from one loan into another, effectively allowing consumers to perpetually defer losses from underwater vehicles, was recognized internally as creating a negative equity time bomb that would eventually detonate. The documents show that lenders and manufacturers were fully aware they were creating an unsustainable cycle. Johnson continues, each time a consumer rolled negative equity forward, the problem compounded. Industry models projected that this practice would eventually reach a mathematical breaking point where new loans simply couldn't absorb the accumulated negative equity, which is exactly what we're seeing now. Third, and perhaps most disturbing, the documents reveal that major industry players have been preparing for this collapse for years while publicly maintaining optimistic outlooks. Strategic planning documents from several manufacturers show they began disaster preparations as early as 2021, explains Johnson. They've been systematically strengthening their cash positions, reducing fixed costs, and restructuring debt with longer maturities, all while continuing to pump unsustainable sales through aggressive lending and leasing programs they knew would eventually fail. This preparation explains why Mary Barra sold such a significant portion of her GM stock. Not because of a sudden market turn, but because internal timelines indicated the bubble could no longer be sustained. She was acting on information reflected in GM's strategic planning that hasn't been disclosed to the public. The most shocking revelation in the documents is the industry's explicit acknowledgement that the fundamental problem isn't temporary or cyclical, it's structural. Vehicles have simply become too expensive relative to consumer incomes, and no amount of financial engineering can permanently bridge this gap. The average new vehicle now costs approximately $48,000, while median household income is around $70,000, explains financial analyst Sarah Williams. This ratio is fundamentally unsustainable regardless of interest rates or economic conditions. The industry has been using increasingly exotic financing to mask this reality rather than addressing the core affordability problem. This explains why Wells Fargo is now approving 150% loan-to-value ratios for subprime borrowers. Not because it's prudent lending, but because it's the only way to keep the system from collapsing immediately. They're essentially providing hospice care to a dying market while hoping for a miracle recovery. The documents also reveal that the industry anticipated exactly the sequence of events we're now witnessing. First, deterioration in subprime performance, then declining used vehicle values. Next, stress at smaller dealerships and lenders. And finally, manufacturing overcapacity becoming undeniable as channel stuffing fails to hide the problem. What makes this situation particularly dangerous is that everyone in the industry can see the collapse coming, but no one can afford to be the first to acknowledge it publicly, explains Johnson. Manufacturers can't admit they've built too many vehicles. Dealers can't admit they're stuck with unsellable inventory. Lenders can't admit their loan portfolios are fundamentally impaired. It's a collective denial that accelerates the ultimate reckoning. This isn't just another market cycle, it's the painful unwinding of an entire business model built on financial engineering rather than economic fundamentals. And the implications for the industry, consumers, and the broader economy are only beginning to be understood. The automotive market collapse isn't coming. It's already here, and the evidence is undeniable for those willing to look beyond the industry's carefully crafted narrative. Wells Fargo approving 150% loan-to-value ratios for borrowers with credit scores as low as 540. CarMax losing 20% of its stock value in a single day and 50% year-to-date. Tricolor Auto Group with 65 dealerships filing bankruptcy after desperately double-counting collateral to stay afloat. And GM's CEO Mary Barra selling 40% of her personal stock before the worst impacts become publicly apparent. These aren't isolated anomalies. They're the unmistakable symptoms of a market bubble that's finally bursting after years of increasingly desperate measures to maintain artificial growth. As James Martinez, the dealership owner we quoted earlier, observed, "In the last 6 months, I haven't made a single dollar of profit. I'm not losing money yet, but the market has completely stalled." His experience is being replicated at thousands of dealerships nationwide as the reality of an unsustainable market structure becomes impossible to ignore. What we've discovered is that this unprecedented market collapse stems not just from economic conditions or changing consumer preferences, but from the inevitable failure of a business model built on financial engineering rather than actual affordability. The industry's reliance on extended loan terms, rolled over negative equity, and increasingly exotic financing couldn't bridge the fundamental gap between vehicle prices and consumer purchasing power indefinitely. For consumers currently underwater on auto loans, approximately 40% of all car owners, this market transformation creates potential financial catastrophe as values continue falling while loan balances remain fixed. For manufacturers and dealers, it forces a painful recognition that the market cannot sustain the production volumes or pricing structures of recent years. But the broader implications extend far beyond the automotive sector itself. With auto loans approaching $1.6 trillion and significant portions of this debt already impaired, the financial system faces potential stress that could spread to other sectors. The approximately 8 million Americans employed directly and indirectly by the automotive industry face uncertain futures as market contraction forces painful consolidation. What we're witnessing isn't just another turn of the economic cycle, it's the painful but necessary correction of a market that lost touch with fundamental economic reality. The largest automotive bubble in American history hasn't just started leaking, it has finally definitively popped.